It is Spooky Source Saturday. Oh, I don't know if you saw that I just manifested a cattail out of my ear. Spooky Source Saturday. I am Dr. Samantha Cottrera for the Imagining a New We video blog, a video series designed to help history teachers and other history educators teach history in ways that are more meaningful, transformative, and inclusive for their students. Source Saturday is a series I have been doing since the fall, talking to historians and creators and archivists about particular sources and talking about how they can challenge a more traditional way that we often teach and learn history. And because I like a good theme and like an opportunity to buy a themed new dress, I put out a call for anyone doing spooky types of history. And I'm putting them together in this series of 5 different Source Saturday videos, Spooky Source Saturday videos, talking about things from graves to hauntings to like ghost walks, and like it's a very cool collection of things. And I did not think that I was going to like learn more about history doing these like spooky conversations. I thought I would just like get to know different aspects of the history, but I have learned so much. And so this introduction is the same for everyone. Then we'll do the introduction for the individual speaker, and then we'll do the video. So I hope you enjoy them as much as I do. They're posting before Halloween so that you can incorporate these ideas into your classroom the week before Halloween. Please comment below if you did incorporate any of these videos into your classroom and what the response was from your students. So let's go over to Zoom. In this video, I am talking with Kat MacDonald. She is a master's student at Western University in the Public History program, and she is interested in things like commemoration and the World Wars. But her real passion is dark tourism, like going to places just for the like spookiness of it, although I'm sure she has a much better definition than I do. And so she is bringing to this conversation her experience with dark tourism, her experience working as a historical interpreter and in other sites of public history, is specifically related to the Kingston Penitentiary and how we can learn from history, or how can we learn about history from the past using these kind of spooky, darker elements of places and spaces. And so I can't wait to meet with her. She's so excited to talk, and I was so excited to be able to meet her and have this conversation. So let's go over to Zoom. Thank you so much, Kat, for agreeing to speak with me for this Spooky Source Saturday video series. I am really looking forward to learning more about dark tourism and about the Kingston Penitentiary and all the things that you're kind of bringing to the study of history. Before we begin, do you want to introduce yourself?
For sure, yeah. Hi, everyone. My name's Kat MacDonald. I'm currently in my second year master's program in public history at Western Ontario, or University of Western Ontario. Back home right now, actually in Kingston, which is what we'll be talking about. It's my hometown of Kingston, Ontario. And yeah, I'm like really into spooky stuff. Always have been super into spooky stuff. So to be able to blend like a topic that is in history and that kind of spooky stuff, it's like the perfect field for me, I guess. So I look at dark tourism in Canada specifically because I feel as though it's not talked about a lot in comparison to like other notable dark tourist sites. And so I'm happy to start expanding that part of the field.
So the other day I spoke to someone that does ghost walks in Winnipeg, and he's like, we hear so much of like the women in white story that I wanted to like bring real research to these ghost stories. And I was like, are you a killjoy? Like, are you just like in doing your historical research? Are you taking like all the like spooky stuff out of it? And like we were joking, but he was saying that it's important to bring these other stories in and to recognize like the different histories and then these like urban myths or these myths. So I say this as a means of introduction, because when you say like I've always been interested in spooky stuff and I'm doing history, like I'm just kind of intrigued about like how those two things came together. Were you like, oh, I would like to ruin all of my spooky memories by knowing all the real facts? Or like you were like, I want to bring this interest to understand the past?
It's definitely the latter. I'd love bringing the interest in because I actually don't think that putting history into it takes away from anything super spooky. Actually, the Haunted Walks of Kingston was founded here, and so that also includes the Haunted Walks of Toronto and Ottawa that were expansions of the Kingston Walk. They actually do history, like research and history research, before they even put a spot on a tour. So they're able to actually bring in that history while keeping that kind of mysterious air about it. And it works like perfectly. It doesn't take away from the scariness. If anything, I feel like when something's older, and there's some history to it, it is scarier than, say, just a new building with no history as of yet.
You're right. No, I mean, I think that is entirely correct. I was saying in my bigger introduction, I wasn't expecting to like learn so much history through these conversations, but it's been really, really interesting when you kind of like lean into these spooky stories, like the different elements that you get from it. So like, what is dark tourism according to you, and how does like the Kingston Penitentiary, like how does that connect to that? What is dark tourism?
For sure. So the definition that was defined in 1996 is any tourism directed to or profiting off of sites of mass tragedy, death, anything of that darker history nature. And so the Kingston Penitentiary unfortunately fits into that due to its long history of there have been deaths on site, and more of that darker Canadian judicial history, because it was Canada's first penitentiary and had been in operation from about 1835 until 2012, 2013.
When was it built? Do you know off the top of your head?
So it was, I don't have the exact date, but it was opened in 1835, and it was still, parts of it were still under construction even when it first opened, because it was actually built by the inmates who would later house the penitentiary, like be in the penitentiary themselves. So they built the place that they would thus spend the rest of their lives potentially.
That's really interesting. And of course, like that's not rare in 19th century institutional buildings. I'm thinking of what was called the mental institution in Toronto, which is now the site of CAMH, Canadian Addiction and Mental, or the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. And they kept up a wall that was built by the inmates or by the patients as a way to like demonstrate and show respect to that history. A couple of the photos that you shared with me are the like people going in for a tour. Can you tell us what we're looking at here?
Yeah, for sure. So this photo was taken in October of 2017 by the manager of the Kingston Penitentiary Tours. And this is a group of tourists outside waiting to get into a tour at KP.
And then you also gave me this really amazing photograph here. Can you tell me what's happening in this photograph?
For sure. So in this photograph, it was taken by John Scott in 1971, and these are soldiers that are going into the penitentiary because at this time there were a few notable riots during Kingston Penitentiary's history, and the riots of 71 are probably the most infamous and caused the most damage. And so right here you have soldiers who are going in to put a stop to the riots, essentially.
And so when we're learning about things like dark tourism and these like different types of stories that, like you said, kind of build on tragedy or mass tragedy, a lot of times we are thinking like a time period really divorced from us, like the 19th century or even the 1920s, 1930s. And so it's interesting that you're bringing in or highlighting this picture from 1971 in relationship to the tourism in 2017, because for some of these people on this tour, like maybe that guy, like they would have been alive in 1971.
Yeah, definitely. And I also think it's such a good comparison because it's almost the same perspective of the shot too. So to me, that was always super eerie to see in a span of less than 50 years, you have two different, and I hate to say clientele, so I'm going to put it in scare quotes, but clientele who are going into the penitentiary, because this place only closed officially in 2013. So that's 7 years ago. So it really wasn't it's not that long ago that people were housed in there, like criminals and former inmates are housed in there, right?
Mm-hmm. So what do you think is lost when we turn these sites into tourism sites? And what do you think is gained by having something that is a tourism site that was an actual prison, 4 or 5 years prior?
For sure. Some things that end up being lost, it all depends on who's running the tours, and the company that may come in and start doing tourism in there. But sometimes we have to be aware that a lot of stories will be lost just based on, unfortunately, on bias. So when you take a Kingston Penitentiary tour, you have actually a really good opportunity, a really cool opportunity to speak to former like wardens and parole officers and people who actually worked at the penitentiary. But you often hear mostly their side of the stories, and you don't hear many of the stories of former inmates. And there's reasons for that. However, people are trying to get the tours to feature and highlight more stories of inmates rather than just focusing on the stories of the officers and wardens and stuff. And in gaining that, I mean, you have the chance to speak to these people who actually, worked in the penitentiary, had experiences, and a lot of people who worked there for a long time, or their father also worked there, and then they ended up working there. Kingston Penitentiary holds a very special place in a lot of people's hearts. It's a strange phenomenon almost.
Yeah. Have you ever been to Alcatraz in San Francisco?
No, but I really want to.
Oh, you definitely need to make that on your list of things to do post-pandemic, because I don't really like, I think as someone in history and someone who was a historical interpreter, I don't really like heavily interpreted museum experiences. I like to be able to kind of feel it out myself, but that one has an audio guide. And what was interesting is that there are stories and voices from people who were inmates there, as well as the guards. And so it was a really interesting kind of back and forth to be able to have mainly the voices of inmates. And it definitely brought like this different kind of feel to it. And I mean, it's funny because the rock itself, like the island, is so lush and green. Like there's so much foliage there that I don't think of it as a dark site. I think of it as a very like uplifting site. But I learned more about that period in history than almost any other exhibit I had been to. And I didn't think of it as dark tourism, but it probably is. So what do you, as someone who is an expert and interest in dark tourism, what do you read from dark tourism sites generally that is important for bringing to the study of history?
That's a great question. I think a lot of times people go to these sites for that, to see something spooky or hear something spooky or to learn more about that darker history. But there's still an interest in history. People aren't going to these sites for any reason. It's because something happened at these sites historically, whether it was good or bad. Historically, there was something there, and humans have this weird morbid curiosity for spooky, unexplainable, darker things. And I think we could use that as long as we have the balance between understanding that we need to respect the fact that something bad happened here, acknowledge that something bad happened here, but also be able to take that and turn it into a positive. Because at Kingston Penitentiary, you do get to see on your tour and just exploring the buildings a history of Canada's judicial system and the treatment of inmates and how that changed over time. And I mean, we still have a long way to go, I'm sure, but you can still see that change even just in the buildings itself. And so I think that's one way you can do it.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because so much of like our buildings, our spaces shape our interactions. And so walking through these places, we can kind of think about that more. Do you find when you have been doing research related to dark tourism that people like that extra dimension of history and understanding like the different layers of interpretation in the past? Or like I was saying with the ghost walks, do you feel like people are looking for that like kind of generic ghost story that just like scares them and then they can move on?
from when I went undercover at one of the KP tours and just taking a bunch, yeah, it was part of some research for a documentary I was doing. I want to see what the tourists were kind of thinking, so I kind of posed as one. But just being a Kingstonian for most of my life and going on all these tours and visiting all these sites, I think at first they go for that spooky thing. It's what draws them to the sites, and that's why the sites, kind of advertise that way. But once there, at least 90% of the people who are there start to actually become interested in history and start to ask more historical questions as the tour goes on, which I think is so fascinating to see that turn from just, I was just interested in something dark, and now I'm like, oh no, now I'm genuinely curious, like what happened, like what's the history of this place,
Yeah. So okay, so my question is, how does dark tourism help us challenge the ways we normally interact with history? That's the big question. But now I'm going to just do a little mini monologue to get to that question, because one of the things I'm so interested in the study of history is things that I don't think we foreground enough. Things like emotion, things like passion, things like imagination, things like curiosity, like those intangible, subjective things that I think are more connected to like our souls, like who we are, and not just like the study of the past. So I wonder if you can like take that mini monologue and like think about that question. Like, is there an intersection there that you see? And that, like, you can say no for sure. But like is there an intersection you see between people's like interest in these things that seem like less objective history and the possibilities for teaching and learning with dark tourism and through dark tourism?
That's why I think dark tourism is really great, because there is that emotional like connection in it, and I think it's what makes it stand out from some other subjects in history, and also why a lot of people don't see it as history right off the bat. Because when you go to these sites, I haven't discovered it so much in Kingston yet, but I'll use a site like the 9/11 Memorial Museum, which is considered a dark tourist site, and there's different levels of dark tourism, but that is one of them. And when you go there, you do feel an emotional response. Either you probably maybe have known somebody who passed away there or who was involved in something of that, and you feel that emotional connection. But even just learning that history, you feel that emotional, something like is provoking that emotional response. Auschwitz is another dark tourist site just based on the very definition, and obviously going there, you're going to feel that emotional response, and I think that's something, it just shows a connection with that history, and it allows for a deeper understanding when you have that emotional response to it. There's something that humanizes it a little more and makes it a little more tangible because it's affecting you for a reason, if that makes sense at all.
Yeah, I love that answer. And it's kind of interesting that you said like it humanizes it, because in a way you're going to a place that isn't full of humans but full of a spirit, right? Like it's like the thing that I don't know. I guess it depends on how people understand the distinction between like human and spirit. But like, it seems like it's an essence that's not just like people everywhere. I think of, for example, the museum exhibit I went to on like Mexico, totally unrelated, and it was just jam packed full of people, and I couldn't really I couldn't be there and appreciate it because it was just so full of people. But I have been to places where I feel like where there is history that humanizes it more, even though there aren't people around, even though it's a site where I'm just like reading something or listening to something. And so that's a really interesting interpretation. Like it humanizes it, even if it's not related, even if it's related to like the ghosts of the history.
Yeah, it's like the atmosphere of it, or just sort of connection that you have. And again, you can call it spirit, but that depends on the person, but definitely the atmosphere. And yeah. I personally love just going to a place that perhaps isn't full of people and having a different experience than somebody else, but then also being able to be like, hey, how did you feel, reading this and learning about this? I'm like curious to see if we had the same, experience or a different experience, and why that would be. Is it because of our personal history or interest? I love that. It's my favorite thing.
Yeah, it's my favorite thing too. I'm like, oh, a empty museum for one, please. Thank you. You know, I think too of, I guess, sites that would be considered dark tourism, but that like people, like there's different responses or ways people come to this. So I'm thinking, for example, of the Emmett Till coffin at the National African American History Museum in Washington, D.C. Did you know that they had Emmett Till's coffin?
I didn't.
No, it's weird and fascinating because the coffin was like disintegrating, so they were going to throw it out and put his remains somewhere else, and the museum took it and restored it. And you can't take photographs in this room. It's a special room that you go in and out. There's pews, like it's set up like a church, just like people would have gone to visitation during his funeral. And when I was there, it was packed full of school kids, and people just like lined up, like looked and then moved. But it was also full of gospel music, and there were pews, and you could sit and have this reflective moment. And it was a really interesting thing for me to see how different people responded to it, because some people took in that affect, and other people just looked at it as like nothing, or like not nothing, but like just another thing. So I guess from there, the question about dark tourism does it depend on the site, or does it depend on the visitor?
That is an excellent question, because I mean, in its definition, right, it's depends on the site, right? Like it's also such a broad definition. I find fault in the very basic definition. I think it should be ever changing as we learn more about it. But dark tourism actually is pretty much dependent on the visitor, but also who is hosting the site. So there are 4 different what we call shades of dark tourism that range from very pale to black, which is the purest form. I guess it's weird to say purest form, but the purest form of dark tourism. And pale often is there is something dark that happens. So it is, a death associated with it, but people are going there for educational purposes or for purposes that aren't mainly to kind of monetize or profit off of, or in any way look at death in a strange way. Like, so churches, graveyards fall under pale tourism too, because you're going there for a different purpose. It just so happens that death is tied into it.
And then the darkest would be people that go there, or like sites specifically for scaring, or is it like the amount of people?
So it could be for scaring. Under dark tourism, there's also something called fright tourism. So that's purposely going scared at some place. A great example, if you ever want to look it up, is called McKinney Manor, and it's in a southern state. I can't recall off the top of my head, but it is insane. People pay a lot of money to go there, and they're allowed to do whatever they want to. You kind of sign your contract saying that you're allowed to be spooked and scared in any way that they deem fit. So there's that kind of tourism.
Seems terrible.
I would never do it. I can't even watch the videos of people doing it. It's really psychological torture, and I would never. But it's there. And then, so a pure dark site, I would argue, is something like Chernobyl. So a lot of influencers went there over 2 summers ago, I want to say, and took photos. Still knowing, A, they were aware of the history of the place. B, knowing that you probably should still not visit Chernobyl. And also your intention of going there was not to learn about the tragedy or the people who passed, but to get a nice Instagram selfie. So you could say that you've checked that off your bucket list. So that intention isn't great. And so that's kind of more in that darker shades kind of thing.
It's interesting that you said that it depends on the site, because I actually, like, when I hear the phrase dark tourism, to me that like represents an actor, like the person that isn't like the tourist and not like the site. And so it's so interesting that it's classified by the type of site and not the type of like tourist or the type of intent of using that site. Because one person I spoke to for this series was on Canadian cemetery history, and so sure, you could go to a cemetery to pay respects to loved ones who have passed, but you could also go there to do a ghost tour or to scare yourself, or also just to like learn about history of like when people died and what we're on, so it's so interesting that it's based on sight and not on like the action or the intent. That's really intriguing.
Yeah, and I think that's why they came out with the shades of tourism based on visitors' intent, because they recognize that it's not the site's fault that it happened there, but rather it's the people who then interpret that history are going to visit that history. So because it's a new field, it's still ever changing like many other fields. And we'll eventually hopefully get a definition that it fits everything that we need, we need.
Well, I mean, you say we, but feel free to single-handedly define it, and I will just use your definition for the rest of the time. No problem.
I don't have a definition yet. Talk to me when I finish my PhD, and then I might have one that I'm very happy with.
Are there other aspects of dark tourism? Sorry, I just got distracted because there's a building across the street, and they have tied like a spooky jack-o'-lantern body head to across their balcony like a laundry line, so it moves back and forth all day, and it's apparently very windy. So every time I look up, I literally feel like this conversation is being haunted. Pardon me?
Who knows what spirit is watching us?
Exactly. Are there other aspects of dark tourism that you think would be helpful for people who are teaching and learning history, especially like high school and middle school kids, like, because they're into like spooky stuff, a lot of them, like, are there other aspects of dark tourism that you think would be helpful to bring into the classroom?
Sure. And the first thing I think I want to say is that dark tourism, as scary as the label can seem and as intimidating as it is, it doesn't have to be that way, right? I don't think we can be scared of that label, but rather it's something that we just need to recognize. Again, it's a darker history. But middle school kids and high school kids do learn darker histories. We just may not label it as such. And I think we should be, playing into the interest of kids. If a kid is interested, they say there's like a haunted building downtown, and they're interested in like the ghost there. A teacher could then, I don't know if it's possible, but maybe take them down to like the class down to the building, and maybe it's an old courthouse, or maybe it's City Hall or something, and then be able to kind of play into the spooky side, but also bring forth that history and be like, hey, so this is the history of the building being built. Here's the person who is said to haunt the place. Here's why they're important, or here's what they did in their lives, and that sort of thing. I don't want to scare kids or anything. That's not the goal at all. But I mean, as a kid, I would have loved that. All my speeches as a kid were about spooky places. If a teacher took me down to a spooky place, anything, even she was teaching algebra, I'd be listening. Personally, I'd probably pay a lot more attention. So I think we're able to play on people's interests in the macabre and darker things, and still be able to teach them something, and they'll still be able to come away with something that they'll hopefully reflect on perhaps for the rest of their life.
That's really helpful, and I like the idea of just like leaning into kids' interests. Like another way to do that too is to get students to use their imaginations about spooky things. So for example, I read the novel Beloved, which is about a ghost and a haunting of spirit, maybe not a ghost, depending on your interpretation, but it takes place just after the emancipation of the slaves in 1863, and I read it in a building that was built in the mid 19th century, because I was working as a historical interpreter, and so during the days, if people weren't in, I was reading this novel, and I was able to like see the building much differently than when I was interpreting it, because I was like thinking about these characters in these spaces. So like, even if teachers don't know like spooky stories of City Hall, you can get students to use things like historical fiction, historical movies, graphic novels to like bridge those ideas and that like spookiness with places, like again, even if you don't know the stories behind them, like to make your own dark tourism sites. Like I think that's really like interesting, because of course algebra doesn't have ghosts or any other spooky things, but you can make those links if you want to connect to those elements of your students' interests.
Yeah, and I think playing into kids' interests and imaginations will just help them love history later down the line. I mean, I was a kid growing up. I'll be the first to admit it was not my favorite subject, and that's probably just in the way it didn't appeal to my interest at the time, and it probably wasn't. And that's I'm not going to blame my teacher for that because they're following curriculum, but playing into kids' imaginations and having some kind humanizing it for them because history seems so intangible as a concept, so making it something tangible, I think, in any form will definitely help foster an interest or at least get them to take something away from a lesson.
Kat, I loved that answer. I think that is so great because I think it really like touches upon such a key element of history education that we need to be doing more of. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation, this like not so spooky conversation. It was so wonderful to meet you and learn more about dark tourism, and thank you for connecting us with the Kingston Penitentiary. You were saying that you don't run the tours, but there are tours available if people wanted to partake in them.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This is a topic I love talking about. So yeah, they do run tours. I know they're running some right now with COVID precautions in mind. And there's a lot of other places in Kingston that you can take tours of too that are supposedly haunted, like Fort Henry in the downtown core. So if you're ever in the Kingston area or driving to Ottawa or something and need to take a quick pit stop, I highly suggest taking a tour here. It was Canada, one of Canada's first capitals, so lots of history here.
And if you can't get to Kingston, there are also like ghost tours and other things like this all over Canada, of course. But Kingston would definitely be the best. Or followed, unless I was talking to the guy that runs the Winnipeg ghost tours, and then I would say that is the best. But like, you know, one of the things, even when I've done ghost tours, like as a participant, the passion of people doing this work is kind of unrivaled in a lot of other kind of interpretive sites. So thank you for bringing that to this conversation. And I look forward to calling you doctor and using your own definition of dark tourism. No pressure, but the countdown starts now.
Thank you so much for giving me the chance. Hopefully this will help, get me going in that PhD and people will see that it's an important topic. It
is, for sure. All right. Have a wonderful afternoon and happy Halloween.
Yeah, happy Halloween. Have a great day.
Thanks. Bye.